And, I think it can be really frustrating to me at times, and I think it's difficult. I think a lot of people sometimes think I'm a robot. I'm not a robot. I have emotions, I have feelings, and it can be really difficult to go through a lot of that. And
Something happened inside a WNBA locker room last weekend that the league is desperately hoping you never piece together, not because it's complicated, but because once you understand the full sequence of events, the entire story the league has been selling you falls apart completely. It starts with a punch, not a metaphorical one. A real, documented, flagrant act of aggression that happened in plain sight, in front of thousands of fans, captured on dozens of cameras, and then somehow officially ignored. That single moment of ignored violence set off a chain reaction so severe that by Sunday morning, ticket prices had collapsed, sponsors were holding emergency meetings, and two of the most important players in the sport were standing at a crossroads that nobody in the front office ever prepared for. Here's what makes this different from every other sports controversy you've seen trending this week. This one has receipts, it has witnesses, and it has a financial trail that points directly at a league that built its entire future on one player and then treated her like she was disposable. So let's go back to the moment it all began, because if you blink past it, you miss everything. It wasn't the loudest moment of the game. It wasn't even flagged in real time by most people watching. Alyssa Thomas made contact, the kind of contact that in any other context, in any other league, with any other player involved, gets reviewed, gets punished, and gets made into an example. Coaches have a phrase for what happened: targeted aggression. It's when a foul stops being accidental and starts being intentional, and everyone in the building feels the shift even if no whistle blows. The referees saw it. The officials reviewed it. And then they moved on, as if the most marketable player in the sport hadn't just been left completely unprotected in the middle of a nationally televised game. That decision, that single call, not made, became the fault line. Everything else cracked along. Because Caitlin Clark didn't stay quiet. And that's the part the league genuinely did not see coming. See, the assumption has always been that Clark would absorb the hits, keep performing, keep drawing the ratings, and trust the institution to eventually do right by her. That assumption was shattered the moment she opened her mouth after being handed the Player of the Month award, a moment the league clearly intended as a goodwill gesture, maybe even as a soft muzzle. Give her the trophy. Let her smile for the cameras, move the news cycle forward. Instead, what happened was the opposite of controlled. Clark took that moment and used it like a spotlight, pointing it directly at the behavior the league had been hoping would just quietly fade from public memory. She didn't just mention the play. She named the pattern. She described what it feels like to be the engine of a billion-dollar machine while simultaneously being the person that machine refuses to protect. The words she used weren't crafted by a PR team. They were too real for that, too specifically angry, the kind of specific that only comes from someone who has been holding something back for a long time and finally decides the cost of silence is higher than the cost of speaking. And then the story shifted, because this stopped being about one player and one bad call and became something much bigger, much harder for the league to contain. Sophie came forward. Now, if you don't know what it takes for a WNBA player to publicly challenge league authority, let me give you some context. Players operate under contracts with conduct clauses so broad that even vague criticism can result in fines. There's a culture of silence that gets enforced not through dramatic confrontations, but through financial pressure, through quiet conversations that carry very clear implications. Players know the rules. They know what it costs to break them. Sophie knew all of that and stepped forward anyway. What she said didn't just support her teammate, it indicted the structure. She asked out loud, on record, with cameras present, why the league is comfortable monetizing its stars while refusing to physically protect them. She asked why the players who generate the revenue are the same players being left most vulnerable on the court. She framed it not as a complaint but as a structural failure, a league that had optimized for profit and forgotten that the people driving that profit are human beings who get hit, who get hurt, and who eventually reach a breaking point. The officials tried to control the room. Sources indicate there was an attempt to limit what was being recorded, to suggest the conversation continue privately away from cameras. Sophie didn't move. And the moment that footage, even partial, even secondhand, started circulating, something shifted in the public conversation that the league's communications team couldn't reverse, no matter how many statements they drafted. Because here's the thing about sports audiences in this era, they're sophisticated. They've watched leagues gaslight them before. They know what crisis management looks like. They know the difference between a genuine response and a carefully worded non-apology designed to run out the clock until the next news cycle takes over. And what they were seeing from the WNBA wasn't remorse, it was delay. While the league was crafting its response, the market was already responding in ways that no press release was going to fix. Ticket resale prices for Sunday's game didn't dip, they collapsed. The kind of collapse that resale platforms flag internally because the algorithm can't process the velocity of the drop. Seats that had been sold out for weeks were suddenly available, dozens of them, then hundreds, with buyers nowhere to be found. The stadium projection models, the ones the league uses to estimate concession revenue, parking revenue, the downstream financial ecosystem of a single game, started showing numbers that hadn't been seen since the pre-Clark era. And that comparison is what makes this moment so significant, because it proves something the league has been quietly aware of but publicly reluctant to admit. The audience isn't there for the institution. It never was. The audience is there for her. The WNBA's financial renaissance, the television contracts, the luxury brand partnerships, the surge in merchandise sales, the primetime visibility, every single piece of it was built on the momentum of one player's arrival. Executives made the calculation that once the infrastructure was built, it would sustain itself, that the rising tide had lifted all boats permanently, that the audience would transfer its loyalty from the player to the league. Sunday's numbers proved that calculation catastrophically wrong. Corporate sponsors don't panic quietly. When a major brand has a multi-million-dollar partnership with a league and that league suddenly can't fill seats for a marquee Sunday game, conversations happen fast. Emergency meetings get called. People who never normally speak to each other directly are suddenly in the same room asking the same question. What are we actually paying for right now? The answer, as of Sunday, was increasingly unclear. And unclear is the most dangerous word in a sponsorship relationship because unclear means the next conversation is about exit clauses. Now let's talk about the injury report because that's where the official story and the real story start to diverge in ways that are genuinely difficult to ignore. Clark was listed as out for Sunday. The league framed it as routine. Rest, recovery, standard procedure. But the timing sits uncomfortably with everything that had just happened. You have a player who just publicly challenged the league's commitment to player safety. You have her teammate doing the same thing on camera, refusing to be redirected. And then 48 hours later, that player isn't on the court. Draw your own conclusions, but understand that the fans already drew theirs, and they drew them loudly, immediately, and with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from nowhere. The boycott conversation didn't start on any one platform. It emerged simultaneously across multiple communities, which is what happens when an idea isn't manufactured, when it's organic, when it reflects something a large group of people were already feeling and just needed a focal point to express. Fans who had driven hours to see Sunday's game were posting in real time about their disappointment, and it wasn't just about Clark's absence. It was about what the absence represented. It was about a league that had made them feel something again, made them invest emotionally and financially in a sport they had started to love, and then seemed to repay that investment by protecting the wrong people. There's a concept in audience psychology called betrayal sensitivity, the idea that the more emotionally invested someone becomes in something, the more acutely they feel it when that thing lets them down. WNBA fans in the Clark era are among the most emotionally invested new audiences in professional sports. They came in already skeptical, already told by a broader culture that this league wasn't worth their attention, and they chose to believe in it anyway. That choice made the investment feel personal. And when something personal gets betrayed, the response isn't passive disappointment. It's active rejection. Which brings us to the question that nobody in a WNBA front office wants to be sitting with right now, and they're all sitting with it. Is this temporary? Or is this the beginning of an exit? The language Clark and Sophie used in the days following the incident wasn't the language of people planning to show up next week and pretend none of this happened. It wasn't calibrated for reconciliation. It was the language of people who have made a decision about what they're willing to accept and have realized the institution they're part of falls short of that line. Insiders close to the situation, people who are in the rooms where these conversations happen, are not describing a player who is managing her image or playing a strategic game of leverage. They're describing someone who is genuinely deeply disappointed in a system she believed in and who is trying to figure out what comes next when the system doesn't change. That uncertainty, more than any specific threat or ultimatum, is what has front offices most concerned. Because a player who is angry is manageable. A player who is uncertain, who is quietly questioning whether she wants to continue, who is looking at what she has built and wondering if the institution deserves to benefit from it, that's a different conversation entirely. And the WNBA, for all its recent growth, does not have a contingency plan for that conversation. They built the infrastructure assuming the foundation would hold. They never seriously asked what happens if it doesn't. The irony, and this is the part that will be studied in sports business courses for years, is that the league's failure here wasn't financial or strategic. It was human. Someone on a basketball court got hit. The people responsible for managing the game looked the other way. And the player who got hit was the one person the entire modern architecture of the league depends on. It didn't require a conspiracy. It didn't require malicious intent. It just required the kind of institutional indifference that accumulates when an organization starts treating its most valuable asset as a guaranteed resource rather than a person who makes choices. Clark has options. That's the thing the league keeps running from in its internal conversations. She has endorsement, visibility, platform reach, and public goodwill that exists entirely independent of the WNBA's brand. The fans who follow her don't follow her because the league told them to. They follow her because she earned it, through her play, through her authenticity, through the very willingness to speak up that the league is now so uncomfortable with. That independence is power. And a player who realizes the extent of her own independence is no longer a guaranteed asset, she's a negotiating partner. Whether the league is ready to engage with her as one is the defining question of this moment. Right now, the honest answer appears to be no. And Sunday's ghost town attendance, the collapsed ticket prices, the emergency sponsor calls, the fan boycott conversations spreading without any central coordination, all of it is the market's way of making the same point Clark already made with words. You do not own this audience. You were trusted with it. That is an entirely different thing. Here's where it lands, and this is the part that will stay with you. We talk about sports leagues as institutions, as brands, as financial entities. We analyze them through ratings and revenue and market share. But underneath all of that, every league runs on trust. The trust of the players that the game will be fair. The trust of the fans that the product is real. The trust of the sponsors that the audience is genuine. The WNBA, in one weekend, managed to stress test all three simultaneously. The players don't feel protected. The fans don't feel heard. The sponsors don't feel certain. That is not a PR problem. That is a structural crisis. And structural crises don't get resolved by handing someone a trophy and hoping the news cycle moves on. They get resolved by institutional change, real, visible, consequential change that makes every person who felt betrayed believe the system actually learned something. Whether the WNBA is capable of that kind of response in the window of time that still exists to matter is the story now. Everything else, the injury report, the boycott, the financial numbers, those are symptoms. The disease is simpler and older and harder to fix. A powerful institution forgot that its power was borrowed. And somewhere in a locker room, in a quiet conversation that hasn't made it to cameras yet, two players are deciding whether to give it one more chance to remember.